Okay, good morning, everybody. UCLA acknowledges the Tongva people as the traditional land caretakers of the Los Angeles Basin. As a land-grant institution, we pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relations of the past, the present, and emerging. Welcome to this panel honoring Marija Gimbutas. My name is Willeke Wendrich. I am the director of the Kurgan Institute of Archaeology at UCLA, the place where Marija taught and developed much of her work and theories. I particularly want to welcome our panelists today, James Mallory, Dorcas Brown, and David Anthony. And they will be introduced to you by Ernestine Elster. Ernestine Elster received her PhD from the interdepartmental program in archaeology at UCLA in 1977. And her thesis advisor was Marija Gimbutas. She was the chair of her PhD committee. Ernestine joined Marija in excavations in the former Republic of Yugoslavia, at Citagre in Greece and at the Grotta Scaloria in Italy. Ernestine has done immense service to archaeology by editing and co-authoring the final publications of many of these excavations, particularly the excavations at Citagre, volume 2 that came out in 2003, and Grotta Scaloria that came out in 2016. She says about this work, and I quote, "I realized that our discipline hides a worldwide embarrassment, abandoned excavations, dug but never fully published." So she took upon herself the important and extremely difficult task of bringing together the many disparate data sets from an excavation undertaken decades ago, collecting things from attics, from old computers, in many different voices, in many different hands. It was really a virtual excavation of an excavation, and it required vision and much persistence. Ernestine's service to the Kurgan Institute of Archaeology similarly has been immense. She was the director of publications for almost 20 years and continues to contribute a great deal to the intellectual and social life of the Institute. Ernestine, I'm delighted that you're here. You've been the driving force behind the organization of this panel, and I give the floor to you to introduce our speakers. You're muted.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Willeke. It's really a pleasure to introduce this distinguished panel organized by UCLA's Kurgan Institute to celebrate UNESCO's recognition of Marija Gimbutas' Centennial in this year 2021. You know, UNESCO's Centennial list of anniversaries includes people with achievements in the fields of culture, education, science, and Marija shares this honor with Beethoven, who would have been 250 years old, Dante Alighieri, for example, 700 years old. It's really, my really great pleasure to be able to introduce first Jim Mallory. Indeed, both of us were Marija's grad students in the 1970s. Jim was born in California, and he got his first degree at Occidental, and then came to UCLA across town and got his doctorate in Indo-European studies in 1975 with Marija Gimbutas as his chair. In fact, in the late 70s, we both were working on the Italian Tavolieri plane, but at different sites, both connected to Marija's last foray into the field, the Neolithic of Italy. Jim joined the archaeology department of Queen's University, Belfast in 1977, excavating, publishing papers, and presenting at conferences internationally, including back here at UCLA. And focusing on Irish archaeology, he published, among other works, The Archaeology of Ulster in 1991, and In Search of the Irish Dreamtime in 2016. But important to our topic today also is his well-known publication of 1989, In Search of the Indo-Europeans, as well as the Oxford Introduction to Proto-Indo-European and the Proto-Indo-European World. Jim retired as professor of prehistoric archaeology in 2011 and is the father of a daughter and 3 sons. Now we turn to Dorcas Brown and David Anthony, married with 3 children. They're consummate archaeologists and partners in life and work. But first, let me introduce Dorcas, who is Dory to everybody, now retired from Hartwick College in New York. Her advanced degree is in museum studies, used to great advantage in her extensive and intensive examination of museum collections in Russia, the Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Hungary. Dory served as co-director of the Samara excavations, which we at the Kotsin were proud to publish recently, a Bronze Age landscape in the Russian steppes, the Samara Valley Project, and its authors, David Anthony, Dorcas Brown, and their 2 Russian colleagues. She has used ancient DNA in her many studies, including the domestication of horses and dogs and the origin of dairying on the steppes. Singly and with David, Dory has published dozens of articles and chapters, including 3 in the current October issue of Nature, with fascinating implications for Bronze Age migrations out of the steppes. Now, may I introduce David Anthony, his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. He's emeritus professor at Hartwick College, New York, and known widely and worldwide for his interdisciplinary and pioneering research in the archaeology of the European steppes, the origin and spread of Indo-European languages, using archaeology, ancient DNA, and linguistics. His 2010 publication, The Horse, the Wheel and Language, How Bronze Age Riders from the European Steppes Shaped the Modern World, was selected by the Society for American Archaeology as the outstanding scientific book for that year. Most currently, David is associate in Harvard's Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, working in the ancient DNA lab, which research has been pivotal to the re-evaluation of Marija Gimbutas's Kurgan Hypothesis. And I mentioned earlier the Samara Valley publication reporting on the archaeological research which they undertook from 1995 to 2002. This work was done with Russian colleagues and an international team. Indeed, it's the first English language monograph describing seasonal and permanent Bronze Age settlements in the Russian steppes and the excavation of a kurgan. I'm about to turn my microscope over to our moderator, Professor Willeke Wendrich, we all call Willeke, and you must have guessed she's from the Netherlands with a MA first from the University of Amsterdam and a doctorate in Egyptian archaeology from Leiden University. Here at UCLA, Willeke is professor of Egyptian archaeology and professor of digital humanities. She holds the Joan Silsby Chair of African Cultural Archaeology and is president of the International Association of Egyptologists and editor of UCLA's Encyclopedia of Egyptology. She has, of course, excavated in Egypt and Ethiopia, and of course, published widely. Professor Wendrich.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elster. We have together an hour and a half, and this panel is divided in 3 parts. I'm going to ask our panel members 2 questions, and then we open it up for questions of the public in the chat. So While we are speaking, please post your questions in the chat and I will bring these questions to the panel members. And then we'll just have a free-flowing discussion as this third part of our panel this morning. So my first question to our panel members is, can you share a memory of working, meeting, or interacting with Marija Gimbutas? And I want to start with Jim.
This is difficult. In fact, this is horrendously difficult. You warned me about this before, but I was not only Marija's student, and she not only supervised my PhD, but she was also my landlady for a number of years. And so, among other things, as part payment for her being my landlady, I had a reduced rent, myself and my roommate, and we pulled her weeds, we chopped wood from the trees, I buried her dog, and a whole variety of other things like that. And consequently, most of our conversations aren't the ones that one sits there and says, well, after I'm dead, or after about 25 years or something like that, what was the one thing you can remember most? And unfortunately, the things that I can remember most are not the types of things that, lend themselves to this sort of a thing. But I will give you only one example, just on the off chance that Giorgio Bucciolati may be listening or something like that. Marija was frequently having parties, and there would become a part in the evening in which she would torture her guests. And I was frequently invited, so I quite enjoyed this. And I can remember one evening she had Giorgio Bucciolati and she had Thorkild Jakobsen, because the famous Danish Near Eastern specialist, in which she forced everybody to sing their national anthems. And this is one of these things you particularly remember. I had not excavated in Italy at that time when she put them through this. So I hadn't been quite aware at how embarrassed Italians get being forced to sing their national anthem. And watching poor Thorkild try to, I think, even remember the national anthem in Danish, it was just one of those memories. And most of the things that I remember are, I'm afraid, like that. There are very few of the, Jim, I'm going to tell you something extraordinarily important I want you to remember and repeat 25 years later. Normally it was, I think the pool needs cleaning. Right, okay, I'll get that done. It's that type of a thing.
Thank you. Dory, what are your memories?
Unfortunately, I never got to meet Marija. I met her through David and his research, and I was very much drawn to her research. I thought I loved the feminist aspect of it, obviously, and I went through her books too. I do make I call them donies. I make little dolls out of dough, and so I call them donies. And also, doni means the one who should receive the gift. And so I just that's how I remember her. That's what I think of her as. But I know as an archaeologist how influential she was, and I really, really respect that.
So my memory of her, I did not have the kind of relationship that Jim had with her, which I regret. I wish that I did know her better. I was a graduate student at University of Pennsylvania at a time in the 1970s when she was still very active. She was still active in the field as an archaeologist. The first time I met her, I was a lowly graduate student and she was an honored speaker. And I just felt grateful that she paused and shook my hand and let me talk about horses a little bit with her. And then 20 years later, I was at a NEH summer school on Indo-European and Indo-European origins in Texas. That she was there and I was speaking now right next to her. We sat next to each other at the speaker's table, and I had to stand up before she spoke and give my presentation, which was partially critical of her. So I was sitting next to her just kind of sweating because I knew I was going to stand up and criticize her. And then I sat down, I got through it. She stood up, gave her talk. And when it was all over and people are milling around in the audience and the speakers stand up at the table, she surprised me by turning around to me and kissing me on both cheeks and saying, "I'm so glad that someone will continue the work." And I thought to myself, didn't you hear me? I was just criticizing you. I didn't deserve this. And she was just so generous. And she was so engaged. The work was so important to her, the archaeology, discovering what actually happened there. And that was just a moment that crystallized that. So that's the moment I remember.
That's a beautiful moment, because it really characterizes the scholar in her, a scholar who knows that we all stand on the shoulders of giants, but we are also critical of our our scholarly forebears.
Right.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Ernestine, I also want to ask you.
Yes, I do have many memories, but one of them I remembered this morning, because I had met her in Budapest, and she had been a visiting scholar. This was in the 60s, probably before 1967, which is when she started her first excavation in the former Republic of Yugoslavia. She was a visiting scholar, and she was there for several months. They had, in Budapest, in Hungary at the time, there was a particular apartment house where the Western scholars were housed. She said to me, "We have to be very careful because I think the apartment is bugged." And I thought, what are we going to be careful about? I don't think we're going to be doing anything that needs to be worried. At any rate, her plan was that after we arrived, I arrived with her daughter and her niece. They would stay in the apartment and we would drive together, because her niece brought her car. The car she had bought was a Volvo, and I don't know how she worked it out, but anyway, we drove from Budapest along the Szeged River, along the river, down the Tisza until we reached Szeged. But we stopped everywhere. Everywhere there was a little museum, and she knew where every little museum was. The first stop was a town with a very long name, Hódmezővásárhely, which I can't forget because we had strudel there. She said, "You're going to love this," and she was right. And then we stopped at every single museum. I wasn't quite sure what I was supposed to do other than observe everything until the first museum. And my job was to speak to whoever was the attendant, whether it was the director or not, while she, who had received permission to take photographs, she photographed all the figurines in the museum and all the pottery. And so whether I could speak Hungarian, which I could not, or German, which I could barely, my job was to keep this man or woman occupied. And so I did my best. And when it was all over, we ended up at a guest house, which was also, of course, run by the government for visiting scholars. We stayed there overnight. And this is the end of the story. We wanted to take a walk because we'd been in the car that whole day in and out, but we weren't supposed to. The person who was in charge of the guest house, I guess, had been instructed not to let these Westerners out onto the street. So we had to do an elaborate charade to explain that all we wanted to do was to take a little walk and then come back. And when it was all over, Marija said, "You did very well. You can travel with me anytime again." That's the story. Thank you very much.
Can I just comment that your story sounds very much like what Dory and I did in the field. together.
That
Because
too.
when we were conducting excavations in Russia, there's always visitors that come out, local officials and that sort of thing. And my job would be to go out and schmooze with whatever visitor came and show them around the site. And Dory had to keep all the work going so that the excavation doesn't stop. He was on top of what was happening in each unit and each level and recording everything, and I was doing the talking. So she was much closer to the excavation than I was at some times. But yeah, it's the same. You have to have those two.
Yep.
Very nice. So, bravo, Dory.
Thank you.
Okay, then I want to go to the second question that I want to put in front of you. And that is linked to the title of today's panel. Colin Renfrew called recent research on DNA a magnificent vindication of Marija Gimbutas' Kurgan Hypothesis. I want to ask Jim to explain a little bit what the Kurgan Hypothesis is for our audience. And then I would like to ask our panelists, why would Colin Renfrew say that? And do you agree?
Anytime you raise Colin Renfrew, I just break into a smile. And I must say, that was a very incredibly generous comment from Colin regarding that. Particularly, I think David and I can remember sitting in Harvard with Colin on one side of a table talking genetics and whatnot. And it was sort of the dying days of the Anatolian hypothesis, which was going slowly. But in any event, Marija, I'm going to go at this in a peculiar sort of way. I will very, very briefly totally acknowledge that what Marija's contribution is that, as you mentioned, we do tend to stand on the shoulders of previous generations. And she took a pre-existing theory, which I'm going to explain a little bit in a second, made it very much her own, developed it, promulgated it, that the homeland of the Indo-Europeans, the world's largest language family, was set in the area north of the Black and Caspian Seas, and could be explained by a series of migrations from this region during the Copper Age, the early Bronze Age, which carried languages and elements of culture as far west as Ireland, as far east as China, to the southern Scandinavia, to the shores of the Mediterranean, and over the northern 2/3 of India. So a massive migration. And she continually argued that during a period in which migration had basically moved off the menu of many archaeologists, certainly in the Western world. Now, what I like to do, however, is put this in a little bit of context regarding the whole subject of the Indo-European homeland. The unity, shall we say, or the common descent of the Indo-European languages was basically its start date, let's say, is around 1800. With linguists developing the theory. And ever since people saw that all these different languages of Europe and Asia were coming back to a single point, they were looking for a place on the planet in which that was the homeland. Up from around 1800 to 1870, if you were going to say, where was that home? Almost any scholar would have said somewhere in Asia. In fact, that's exactly the words that Max Muller used, somewhere in Asia. And it was generally somewhere between the Hindu Kush and Bactria, all the way up to, say, the Caspian Sea. It was normally regarded generally in that area. And it was pretty well, that was the status quo, that everybody agreed. There were a few people who argued, no, it was in Europe, but by and large, they were ignored. And I would have to mention that one linguist, Theodor Benfi, actually said it was north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. But this is on purely linguistic grounds. Then at about the tail end of the 1870s, a new theory developed that it was in Europe, and it really took off, certainly among European scholars. And it was not just in Europe, it was in Northern Europe. And it became further and further cemented into what we'll call the orthodoxy regarding where did the Indo-Europeans come from. And it was thought anywhere from the Baltic or Southern Scandinavia, North Germany, places like this. And by this time, certainly by around 1900, archaeology had entered into the debate, and archaeological evidence was being used. Before then, it was purely linguistic evidence or geographical, or in the late 1870s, it was physical anthropology. But now archaeology entered, and certain major cultures were regarded as absolutely critical. They were either the homeland culture or a main area of early Indo-Europeans. And these would have included the main Neolithic culture of Northern Europe, the TRB culture of Southern Scandinavia and Northern Germany. Also, the Central European linear bond ceramic, the Neolithic culture that extended all the way from, well, the Netherlands to the frontiers of the Ukraine. And most importantly, the corded ware culture, which is sort of a Copper Age to early Bronze Age culture that extended all the way from the Atlantic to the Urals. So it had a vast area. And the corded ware culture is particularly believed, to have developed out natively out of these cultures of Northern Europe. And Northern Europe was the front runner entering the 20th century. However, a new theory promulgated by a linguist, Otto Schrader, towards the very end of the 19th century, suggested he had a better idea, and his better idea was it was the area north of the Black and Caspian Seas. And the arguments for this were primarily geographical, a question of the positioning of the Indo-European dialects, linguistic paleontology, that is the ability to reconstruct what this proto-language knew culturally and environmentally, and it seemed to, for him, fit best north of the Black Sea. But Schrader was a multitasker, and he also realized, well, what's there archaeologically? And he talked about the archaeological cultures of the steppe as they were known at around 1900. Now, this theory, it was cheered on, for example, by the great French archaeologist Solomon Reinach, thought this is a new theory that looks like it has wheels on it. But even in the 1910s, by 1912, Sigmund Feist, who agreed on it and produced a whole monograph on Indo-Europeans, described it as ziemlich isoliert, rather isolated. And it had far more enemies than it had proponents. Come the 1920s, and we enter with probably the biggest name in archaeology in the first half of the 20th century, V. Gordon Childe, who writes a book on Indo-European origins. And he is quite favorable to the idea of the steppe origin. He sees it's got problems, but he's quite favorable to it. And he mentions many of the items that would later appear in Marija's arguments, that what we've got here in the steppe is a more pastoral society, and that accords better with our image linguistically or culturally and linguistically of the Indo-European languages. It looks like, it is a more warlike society, and argues that we have evidence here of battle axes and things like that. And then we have the questions with the Indo-Europeans, we expect domestic horse and we expect wheeled vehicles. And therefore, maybe things can be reversed. Maybe this great corded ware culture actually came out of the steppe. Now, he doesn't say it absolutely, but the idea is there, and he's clearly favorable to it. It has chronological problems. But you have other writers, famous writers of the 20s as well, Peake and Fleur. They also accept this and began talking about migrations from the area. And by the 1930s, we then get better and better studies. Tadeusz Sulimirski gives one in which he argues, look, this corded ware culture, he thinks the earliest elements in it look like they're coming from the steppe. And he says, and this is probably the expansion of the Indo-Europeans. And you get a whole monograph devoted to the steppe theory by the French archaeologist Georges Poisson. And you also get an article by Sir John Myers from England regarding the Kurgan, and they're all coming up with similar ideas, different in detail, that this area of the steppe seems to have exploded. And we're going to enter another trope, because when Sulimirski wrote his article and he sort of wanted to say, well, what type of culture is it from the steppe? He called it the Kurganenkultur, the culture of the Kurgans. And Georges Poisson called it, the civilisation de Kurgan. So once again, in Sir John Myers, Kurgan culture. And so we get another trope. This steppe culture is called the Kurgan culture because they bury their dead under kurgans, etc. Come the 1940s, the theory is still out there. There are many other theories. You have to remember, archaeologists are talking among themselves. They may not be listening to linguists. Linguists are going their own way and coming up with their own homeland solutions. And so there is still an absolutely wide variety of solutions to the homeland. But I see another trope coming in the 1940s, and it comes out of an argument actually as to what form of mobility did these steppe people have when they expanded? Were they on horseback or were they in chariots? And there was an argument that has continued down to this very day, by the way. We are, as you can see, accumulating tropes of a single steppe theory. In order to deal with that, there were several solutions. Wilhelm Schmidt, one of the founders of the Kulturkreislehre, the anthropological school from Austria, argued there must have been at least two migrations, two waves. And the English archaeologist, Terence Powell, argued, yes, he believed that there were also two waves, but they were reverse order from the ones that Schmidt had been offered. So we have another trope, that it wasn't a single expansion, there were waves of expansion. Now, all of this takes us up into the 1950s. At this period, the steppe theory was simply just one of many, and it has its critics. And I just need to very briefly, I want to quote one of the critics, because we're about to move on to Marija and how she moves it on. One of the critics, and this was a knowledgeable critic who knew, steppe archaeology and East European archaeology, who said regarding the origin of Indo-Europeans, the culture in South Russia of the second millennium BC the cultures then are not the mother cultures of the later cultures that are attributed to the speakers of South, West, and North Indo-European. In other words, quit looking in the steppe lands for where did the Germans, the Celts, the Italic-speaking peoples, all of these other people came from. And indeed, it was sort of dismissed. This is a trope that's gone on almost too long, that people have been continually looking to the steppe lands to explain what they can't explain in their own area. Linguists will understand that, because if you find any linguistic isolate, someone's going to be looking for it in the Caucasus Mountains, because there's so many different languages there. Well, the steppe looked like this great mother of area that you could keep going to. And the same critic went on to say, there is no archaeological support for the assumption that the culture of the pit graves, that is the Yamnaya, that is the main culture that Marija was talking about, has been a very expansive culture, which brought the so-called corded ware and battle axe culture to Northern Europe, as it was thought some time ago. That was an old theory. Now, the first thing that Marija had to do when she made her Kurgan theory is take on that critic. And that critic was Marija Gimbutas, because I have just quoted Marija's first paper on Indo-European origins. And she starts her interest in Indo-European origins with that paper. But the fact of the matter is, maybe through, after the decades looking back, forgetting exactly what her position was, she was the foremost critic of the theory that we are honoring her for. And what could have only happened is that in the bowels of Harvard University, when she was doing her research for her first monograph on the Neolithic cultures of Eastern Europe, she saw enough evidence to disassociate herself from her earlier statement, and she accepted the idea that it was the steppe. And she, among other things, then throughout the rest of her academic career, ran building the steppe argument and the idea of migrations further and further. I would say, however, that if you take a look at all of her writings, when it comes to corded ware origins, she is always fairly reticent, does not say that much, does not pull out the type of evidence that she uses to argue for other areas of Europe, other than the most generic connections, that you can imagine. That is, well, the corded ware culture buries people under earthen mounds. They bury people under earthen mounds in the steppe land, and just a few things like that. But it was never a particularly strong part of it. And I mention all this to show, people change. And we do stand, this was a theory that had been out there. And the thing is that Marija made it her own. And she made it her own, so her name was completely associated with the idea of the Indo-European expansions with the homeland in which she called the Kurgan culture. And the ancient DNA evidence that we were talking about that emerges, primarily in 2015 in two papers in Nature that indicated that up to 80% of the males that had been tested and examined in the corded ware culture bore an ancestry that indicated that they had derived from the steppe. That is confirming the basic tenet of Marija's theory that, and the further studies, the major genetic type of what we'll call native males in Ireland today, for example, continue carrying that steppe gene and things like that. So we can go into, it becomes much more complicated when we take a look all over Europe and we start getting into the various genetic components of different societies. But this is, I believe, what Colin Renfrew was referring to when he's talking about, a sort of a vindication of this, because she was, as a major archaeologist, to some extent, a voice crying out in the wilderness for quite some time. And therefore, to see that the genetic evidence had fallen her way rather than perhaps more trendy ways is what we're talking about.
Thank you. That was a very clear explanation and a very deep history of this theory. And perhaps someone we can call a reformed theorist. So, Dori, I would like to get your perspective.
Well, I came into this through David, as I said, in his research. And I've always been a person who loves working in the field. And so I was happy to go in the field in Russia and do whatever, we could together. It was always a treat for me. It was hard sometimes, but it was still very rewarding. And so I did start working on the whole question of the domestication of the horse, and when and where did this happen, because they did seem to be very key to Indo-European spread. And so obviously the horses are strong and vital in the steppes of the Eurasian steppes, and so going to Russia and digging at Krasnosamarskoye was part of what we were trying to do, and look for horse bones. We didn't find horse bones at Krasnosamarskoye. We found something else, which is another wonderful, amazing story. But before that, I did all this research to how would you even identify a ridden horse? And so I started looking for bit wear on horse teeth. And that was, we gathered as many samples archaeological samples as we could. And then we started looking at modern samples.
This is a horse jaw.
This
lower
is a horse
jaw.
mandible.
Yeah.
And for people who aren't riders, there's a bit that sits in the horse's mouth.
Here.
That this is how the rider controls the horse. And so I figured if you had something hard that would that we didn't know if like rope or leather would work as a bit. We figured that would get chewed up pretty fast. But so we tried looking at just bit wear for metal bits just to see where it might be. And so we looked at a lot of modern horses that we knew had been ridden and took measurements of this tooth right here, the front tooth. Is the bit sits here, the horse uses his tongue to lift it up and sit here, because then it won't hurt him and he can do whatever he wants. He doesn't have to go where his rider wants him to go. And this happens in all horses, it turns out. Pretty much. There's a lot of riders who proclaim that their horse never takes the bit in its teeth, that they're so well trained. But even sometimes you can tell, you can look at these teeth. Now this is a wild horse and he has nice clean teeth. You got this nice straight angle here. Can you see that? You kind of can see that.
Yeah, there.
Yeah. And on a horse that's been ridden, this angle will be run down a little bit, and sometimes it kind of gets rounded, and sometimes you get a real strong
flat
bevel there. Yeah. We saw that at a horse at Bataille. We went to Bataille to look at the teeth that they were finding there. And of course, Bataille is later than Yamnaya, and who we think were the original horseback riders. But Bataille didn't have metal bits, and it actually did have quite a good bevel on it.
On 5, there were 5, I think. There were 19 P2s at Bataille that were suitable for study, and 5 of them had these kinds of bevels that were associated with the use of metal bits. It's a pathology on horse teeth that's associated with the use of bits in modern horses. But then we had to figure out whether rope and leather bits created the same kind of wear, because in the prehistoric past, that's probably what they used first.
So we ran experimental studies. There's a New York State University nearby us that has a horse training and behavior program. And we went to them and said, what do told them our story, and they said, can you do some experiments for us? And sure thing, they thought that was great. And we had a hemp rope bit, and we had a leather bit, and a horsehair rope bit,
and a sheep bone,
and a bone bit, because that was our hard bit. And we did find that really they all created a little bit of wear that of course we were looking for it. It was subtle, but it was definitely there, and that the horse puts a bit in its teeth. And there was some controversy, because how could a rope possibly wear down the hard enamel? Well, ropes, just like the grasses that they eat pick up soil and little grit from the soil, and then that just gets ground and ground in. If you have a bit sitting there for a long time and you're pulling on it a lot, that grinding will create some wear. It is subtle.
But the agent of wear was really a grit that was really dirt in the horse's mouth, and it got trapped underneath the rope bit or the leather bit and wore away the tooth. So it still created significant, statistically significant wear in these horses, which we only had time to ride them 100 hours each.
Yeah.
But that's 600 hours of riding for 4 horses with 4 different organic mouthpieces.
Yeah.
And over the course of 150 hours, there's a significant increase in wear on that front corner.
So we think they certainly could. Yamnaya certainly could have been riding horses. Probably were. We certainly believe they were.
But one of the problems was we didn't have Yamnaya teeth. We had teeth from Batai in Kazakhstan. It's a different culture, and it's approximately the same age as Yamnaya. So we could point over to Kazakhstan and say there's horses being ridden over there at the same time as Yamnaya, which is the core culture for the Kurgan culture. But we actually did not have Yamnaya horse teeth because Yamnaya sites are so much more ephemeral.
Yeah.
Yamnaya people were so mobile that they, east of the Don River, from the Don to the Ural River, which is a huge area, there's no settlement sites at all, none. And we looked for them. West of the Don in what is today Ukraine, there are settlement sites that are Yamnaya settlement sites, and there's some horse bones in them,
but no teeth. we couldn't find the
not that tooth. So we couldn't do what we had originally intended to do on Yamnaya collections themselves.
But now, should we talk about the DNA
sure,
paper?
But yeah.
Yeah, the new DNA paper that came out that has yesterday, yes, that proclaimed that the Dom2 was the origin of modern horses.
Genomically, just genetically only, there's this label DOM2, Dom2, that is the designation for the lineage that includes modern domesticated horses. And the point of the paper was to find the earliest Dom2.
And they couldn't find any earlier than much later, that 2000 BC. Yamnaya
2200
2200 BC. And so
yeah. So they said in the abstract that Yamnaya was not that horse riding was not part of the Yamnaya expansion, and that's not supported by the data that they presented,
the genetic data
in the paper. They also say in the paper, if you read in the paper, that Yamnaya horses were directly ancestral to Dom2. Dom2 evolved in the Volga-Ural steppes. This is where domesticated horses came from. There's no attention in this recent Nature paper to the evolutionary process that led to Dom2. And that's what really we're interested in, is the people who were living in the steppes during the period between wild horses, which we have in this study, 5500 BC, definitely wild, and the earliest Dom2, 2200 BC. Yamnaya horses are much, much closer genetically to Dom2 than they were to the wild horses that were in the same area, that were the pre-Dom2 ancestors of Dom2. But so Yamnaya people, here's the thing with genetics, with DNA. There is no gene for riding.
Right.
There is no gene for sacrificing horses in human graves. There is no gene for milking horses. And these are all things you have to look at other kinds of evidence, archaeological evidence, in order to determine when these important human behaviors related to horses really began. And now we have evidence from human skeletal pathologies of the earliest pathologies associated with riding in human skeletons are found in Yamnaya skeletons. This is just about to be published. And second, there's there is horse milk in the dental calculus of Yamnaya individuals, also just published in Nature. It's the earliest horse milk identified by peptides, dairy peptides, anywhere in the world. They also tested the calculus from the teeth of people from Batai, and they did not have horse milk in their dental calculus, but Yamnaya people did. And then there's also evidence from zoology. The larger horses began to appear in Eastern Europe around 3000, 3300 BC, the same time period as early Yamnaya. So how do you explain the expansion of these large horses, which by European zoologists are usually ascribed to the expansion of horses from the steppes, where horses were known to be larger than the indigenous European horses. So we know that Yamnaya people were actually riding horses, that they were milking horses, they were sacrificing horses in their Kurgan graves, and larger sized steppe horses expanded into Eastern Europe at the same time as Yamnaya. So the conclusion that's in this new paper published yesterday, which I'm a co-author of, that's in the abstract, that said that horse riding had no connection with the Yamnaya expansion into Europe. What they really mean is that Dom 2, specifically Dom 2, was not associated with Yamnaya. Yamnaya horses were just one step shy of being fully modern horses genomically, but we have all of this other evidence for how they were being used by people in the ways that are really significant. Now, it's kind of interesting what's come out of this research that I think is really quite fascinating, is that the genes that separate Yamnaya horses from Dom 2, those tiny genetic changes, are in two areas of the genome. One is controls emotions, fear, calmness. And so Dom 2 horses were probably less skittish, calmer, than Yamnaya horses were, and they were more tolerant of the violence and the noise of a battlefield. It might be that Yamnaya horses could not be ridden into battle because they were too skittish. So for a Yamnaya person to advance towards a predator or an aggressive human, they may have had to dismount. So Yamnaya horses were more like cats than like dogs. If violence was coming, they were saying, "You're on your own, bud," rather than like a dog who would stand beside you and fight. That's one difference. And the other genetic difference is in the area of the lumbar vertebra. And it's probable that Yamnaya horses tired more quickly from long bouts of riding. And the backs of Dom 2 horses were better adapted to long bouts of riding. So Dom 2 horses were calmer, and they were better adapted to long periods of riding in their lumbar vertebra. And so that made them more useful in warfare. But Yamnaya horses were perfectly rideable, and they were ridden. So they still played a role in the Indo-European expansions.
Interesting that you are co-author on a paper you don't agree with.
When there's 60 authors, you know, if there's 60 cooks in the kitchen, the product that comes out is not necessarily going to be what every single cook wanted.
Yeah,
And,
no, and it also illustrates very clearly the problem with geneticists speaking too much about archaeology. I've literally heard geneticists say, well, this is supposed to be another group, but they don't behave like they should. That's exactly, that summarizes the problem with people who put a lot of emphasis just on one type of evidence. So we have to remain very, very critical.
I'd like to address one other aspect of Colin Renfrew's comment that Marija's theories were vindicated. You know, Marija's theories were multifaceted. She had a narrative, a complex narrative that she had laid over this period in the steppes in southeastern Europe, particularly old Europe, and the incoming mounted, patriarchal, violent steppe people replacing the egalitarian, peaceful, female-centered old European society. That was a part of her narrative that I don't think it's been partially vindicated, but it hasn't been certainly completely vindicated. And also her conception of migration was a 1950s conception of migration. And the process that she describes is essentially, as Jim said, she didn't really explain how corded ware was connected to the Kurgan culture. There are these little places in her narrative where it's very, very thin in terms of explanation. And her explanation of how the Kurgan culture migrations happened was essentially the Huns lining up on the horizon and then sweeping in and replacing everything, rather than there being admixture or adjustment or mixed cultures. And the whole concept of a wave, the waves the waves of migration. A wave has no intentions. It falls randomly on the beach and covers everything. It's not taking risks. It's a bad metaphor for a multi-generational process of migration involving risk-taking humans who have goals in their head and have targets that they're going to. That's just not what a wave is about. And I would like it if we would use streams of migration rather, because most migrations are targeted towards a very specific place. And so you'll have, one village in Mexico that the people from that village are going to a single barrio in Los Angeles. And they continue, it's multi-generational from that village over a long period of time. And that's called chain migration. And it's a regular process in migration. And that's the kind of regularity within the migration process that you could look for archaeological indicators of, that she just wasn't even talking about. So I think that to the extent that we still have to use migration, and migration is becoming even more important now with the DNA evidence showing that these really large migrations really did happen, long distance ones. We have to have better models of migration than the models that she was using, which are really kind of simplistic 1950s models. That certain elements of her narrative are absolutely vindicated. And that's what really Colin was talking about, but it's not the whole thing.
Thank you.
If I could slip one statement in here, purely because David is, ever since we first encountered each other, he knows that I will always poke him with something or another along the way. Regarding Marija's handling of the expansions and migrations, she does, I think, speak quite a bit actually of hybridization. Many of the culture, globular amphora, for example, and corded ware. She freely admits that this has not been a population replacement, but rather cultural transfer and things like that. Because she had the physical anthropologists looking continually at the data, and they weren't coming back telling her perhaps what she may have, wanted to hear. They were basically saying they were finding very little evidence, if any evidence at all. This is the craniologists, people looking at skulls and whatnot, for, shall we say, Yamnaya skulls in populations in Northern Europe, and therefore she had to, I think, I don't know whether she backtracked and this was, you have to understand, the steppe theory, ever since the very beginning, certainly since the 1920s, looked at hybridization as one of the processes of these migrations, that it wasn't, pure blood steppe people replacing other populations, but very often coming in as minority populations and somehow affecting the population culturally and certainly linguistically if they're going to try to carry that on. And I find the hybridization certainly all the way to her final publication, the one done in German for the Archaeolingua sequence. She always had the hybridization, I think, there. So I think we could sit there and say, yes, her models regarding migration certainly were, I don't think they went ever outside of her own imagination to, what we'll call any existing data. But nevertheless, she at least had certainly room for linguistic spread without, shall we say, total military dominance or something quite like that.
We are an hour in and we have another half an hour available, and I want to turn to some of the questions from the audience. What I take away, by the way, about this exchange is how important it is to keep going back to the evidence. And you've also shown the importance of ethnoarchaeological work, analogies with modern migration, for instance, and experimental work, the work you've done with the bits on the horses. Those are ways of archaeological analogy that we all use. Some people are more explicit about it than others. But I think in this case, you both show that these are important points of information, similarly as DNA analysis is a point of information. I have
Look, I have a question for David and Dory also, just if I may. In the excavations that you've done over these years, did you come across any evidence of wagons? Because that's part of Maria's, I think, hypothesis that there were wagons. Because if there were migrations and horses, that there were wagons. And
yeah, so a basic part of the horse, the wheel, and language is about the role of the combination of horseback riding and wagon transport. And wagon transport is shown archaeologically during the Yamnaya period, earliest in the steppes. That's the earliest wagons in the steppes. And wagons appear at that time from Mesopotamia all the way up to Scandinavia, with radiocarbon dates between about 3400 and 3100 BC. And it's really impossible to say where the wheel was invented or where wagons were invented. But the wheel and wagon principle, the axle and wheel principle, was invented and spread rapidly during the period that we're identifying as the origin of at least the later Indo-European languages. So I think what happened was that people in the steppes who were already riding these rather skittish horses acquired wagon technology. Since Herodotus described the Scythians in 450 BC, nomadic pastoralists in the Eurasian steppes have been described as relying on these two kinds of transport. Horses for herding, they greatly increase the efficiency of herding and allow you to have much larger herds with no increase in labor. Herding, warfare, and rapid travel. And then wagons for residential needs. They carry everything you need to move your home, including firewood and food and water and tents and those kinds of things. So you put that together and you've got a technological basis for the invention of nomadic pastoralism. And I think that was really what underlies the Yamnaya expansion. They invented nomadic pastoralism by combining these two transportation technologies. And there are wagon parts in hundreds of Yamnaya graves, literally hundreds of Yamnaya graves. We have never excavated one of those, but they're there. They're relatively rare among Yamnaya graves, but there are hundreds of them from the Urals down to the lower Danube. And I think that what happened is that the combination of wagon transport and horseback riding permitted people to exploit the plateaus in between the river valleys. Before that, all the populations had been in the river valleys that are going across the steppes, which are these little ribbons of productive ecosystems surrounded by grasslands. And nobody had been exploiting the grasslands at all. And once you get Yamnaya, they begin to construct burial mounds, kurgans, in the grasslands between the river valleys, the first human monuments occupying those grasslands. And then all the settlements in the river valleys disappear, just totally can't find where Yamnaya people were living because they were so mobile. That's
evidence of wagons.
That's, yeah, wagons is part of that. Wagons actually put the river valleys inside a vehicle on wheels, all the resources of the river valleys. And then you could follow your herds through the warm season outside the river valleys. And all of the settlements in the river valleys, with a few exceptions in what is today Ukraine, all of the settlements in the river valleys were abandoned, which is one of the defining features within steppe archaeology. It's one of the defining features of Yamnaya archaeology is the absence of settlement evidence. So we looked for them. We used Western techniques looking for very low density archaeological sites during the Samara Valley project, and we did find very low density archaeological sites from the same kind of culture as Yamnaya, not Yamnaya itself. It's a local variant called Poltavka. But the only reason we found those sites was because they were in the same favorable locations that were used later on by more sedentary people who left much larger artifact deposits. That's what we were digging. That's what we found. Within those artifact deposits from the late Bronze Age, we found a very occasional Middle Bronze Age sherd. If that's all there had been there, it's below the threshold of archaeological visibility. We would never have found those Middle Bronze Age sites. The artifact counts are, one small sherd per 4 by 4 meter square. And under the ground, too, it's not on the surface. And you're just not going to find those.
Okay, I want to go to a burning question that one of our audience members has. David Butchever asked, what is the status of the idea that the steppe pastoralists may have displaced the farmers because they introduced plague, decimating the established population? Is this an area of current research? Are there any references? And Jim, I would like to ask you to.
My first thing is because they say David should probably.
Okay.
I mean,
Well,
there are articles, yes, because Yersinia pestis has been found. I'm by no means an authority on this. I have read some of the articles, and here David can certainly correct me on it. But remains or evidence of Yersinia pestis has been found in the Cornedwar culture, but it's also been found in somewhat earlier cultures in Scandinavia as well. And I think periodically, at least once a year, we get a new article regarding prehistoric evidence for plague. And the presumption that the steppe populations introduced it and therefore probably had dealt with it far better than the populations into which it was being introduced. It raises really, really serious and interesting questions. And I think it's just hideously problematic as to how much we're going to be pinning on plague and to what extent, it really would have caused, such major changes. What you do find so far right now is an amazingly rapid genomic change, certainly in Britain and in Ireland, at the introduction of the beakers at around, let's say, 2400 BC. In which case we've got, evidence of the beakers with the steppe gene and whatnot, and almost everybody who comes after them is largely that. When before the introduction of the steppe gene, the entire population, well, the overwhelming majority of the population would have been a combination of what we'll call Neolithic Mediterranean so-called Anatolian farmer genes mixed with the Western hunter-gatherer genes of Western Europe. And that means genetically, certainly from the male side, a lot of people must have disappeared, or at least that's what it looks like. That's what the genetic story. And therefore, reaching for plague is one of the things that people do. But on the other hand, what is the paleodemographic reasoning here? Because plagues tend to wipe out females just the same way as they wipe out males, one would have thought. And it, if it decimated the entire population, where it's this type of a thing. We have what looks like a strong potential argument. Well, that's enough. And I don't think that's enough regarding the plague argument. And I think we're going to be toying with the plague argument probably for a number of years to know, how serious an archaeological impact that may have had actually on the societies into which it was introduced. But certainly there are a lot of, the genetics has thrown up a lot of extraordinarily interesting problems for archaeologists to lie awake at night thinking about.
I think Jim did a great job with that question.
Okay, great. Another question. A lot of writers do not use a bit in horses' mouths. They use a hackamore or the like. Why does only evidence of bitware indicate a domesticated horse?
Yeah.
Well, because if you didn't have a bit, then there would not be much to look at on a horse skeleton,
Right.
except for the riding pathologies.
The absence of bitware doesn't mean anything. So
Right.
that we've always said that. It's the
Yeah.
presence of bitware that means something. And that's what we were looking for. We made no argument at all from the absence of bitware. We never said that if bitware is absent, therefore horses are not being ridden. Horses can be ridden with other control mechanisms. So we've always been very clear about that. It's the presence of bitware that's an interesting thing that nails it in a prehistoric sample. If it's absent, we can't say anything about what they were doing with. They might have been riding them, but yeah.
I wouldn't know.
You're muted, Ernestine.
We're muted?
No, Ernestine.
Oh.
You're still muted.
I was just agreeing with you.
Oh, okay. Helly Guyeri just let us know that the Nature article appeared in the Estonian newspaper today. There were 5 horse samples from Saaremaa Island in the DNA study.
All right.
Okay.
Excellent.
It finds its way internationally.
Famous.
Let's see. Someone's asking for Gimbutas' theories of early worship of a female or goddess origin, her use of symbols to correspond to an early matrifocal emphasis, which is something that Marija was famous for as well. And Dori, you indicated that you're creating little doe emails. Yes.
There they are. Okay.
Thank you. Beautiful. Okay.
She made the first one when I applied for a tenure track job, and I got the job. So
I make them every year.
Yeah.
It's a New Year's resolution kind of thing.
But if the question is how was Marija inspired? Is that what the question is? I think if you, in her book on the Balts, the one on the Slavs, she really does present all of her research having to do with folklore and mythology and folktale, which she grew up with as a child in Lithuania. And I think she was very much influenced in that, in her identification of these little figurines, part of her pantheon. At least that's my idea. I know that she expanded it tremendously. Maybe Jim has something to say about it because he was in the seminars and she was talking, when she was lecturing on her ideas about Europe and pantheon of gods and goddesses. Remember that, Jim?
Yeah, in 1968, when she was giving her lectures to us on the European Neolithic, she would frequently illustrate figurines. But normally she would only describe them in terms of very generic terms. In other words, that one has a face like a bird, this type of a thing. And at that time, I certainly do not have anything from my notes of that time. I actually have my notebooks from 68, indicating that she had any idea of a pantheon or anything like that, of particular deities that she ultimately developed. And I also knew that I think it was 67, 68, in between the first and second seasons at Obre in Bosnia. She had done a lot, probably, well, when she met up with Ernestine, she was photographing and gathering photographs of figurines. So it was quite interesting with her, but I don't think the ideas had been fully developed. The one thing I knew she had is the idea that what were frequently regarded as distorted faces and whatnot were actually masks, and that we should be looking at these figurines, I would have thought, perhaps more the way you might, well, from a European perspective, European early drama and the actors, or having been raised also with American Southwest archaeology, like Kachina dolls. That is, that they were probably representing masked dancers. That's such a part of the ritual. So that was probably part of the idea, but it had not fully developed. And then, unfortunately, I had a 3-year sabbatical in 1969. So I did not see how her ideas regarding Neolithic religion had developed. And so when I came back out of the army and sat in on her new class of on Neolithic religion, there was nothing that had prepared me for what I was about to do. I remember sitting in a large room in which I don't think there were many males sitting around the table to begin with. And it was large rectangle. She wasn't showing slides. She was showing illustrations from her first book, The Gods and Goddesses of Old Europe. And they were simply being passed around, and she would, no qualms whatsoever. And here's a picture of a crawling uterus. And myself and Ray Sidris felt like we basically had walked into the woman's shower room or something like that accidentally. So I just sort of disappeared from the scene whenever goddesses were mentioned after that. And I can't add to the intellectual history beyond that. But whatever happened, it happened in the years between 68 and around 71 then or so.
We aren't really talking about the pantheon. This is all about the Kurgan hypothesis. That was the idea of this particular panel, because I think that to discuss the Maria's pantheon and everything that has resulted from that in the world and how the world has looked at her pantheon, that's an entirely different topic. But if David and Dory have anything to say, just to answer that other question, I would love to hear that. Otherwise, maybe go on to another question. Do you have anything to say about that? We did. You have that little doll of your own.
Sorry, Ernestine, you're very difficult to understand. Somehow your microphone is...
Go off.
No, it didn't go off.
Closer. Yeah, that close is better.
Yeah, close is better.
I was relaxing.
Yeah, that's good. But anyway, before I ask David and Dory to react to this, I also have another horse question that I want to put
Bring
in
up.
as well. In the Nature, Thomas Bloch writes, in the Nature article, the main argument that Yamnaya was not driven by horses is that the genes for horses don't move at that time. Instead, they move around 2000 BC and then appear everywhere. Can you comment on this later expansion of horse and possible Indo-European language movement at that time?
Okay, so let's consider Yamnaya expansion first within the steppes. And we'll put geographic borders on it. Within the steppes, we have lots of evidence for the expansion of these earlier horses, the Yamnaya horses, pre-Dom II horses, within the steppes. When Yamnaya itself expanded into southeastern Europe, did the steppe horses go with them? We don't know from this article because we didn't have samples that passed screening that were from Yamnaya contexts, say in Hungary or Romania or Bulgaria, where we do have Yamnaya genes and we have Yamnaya graves. So we just don't know if the horses went with them. Did horses go east to the Altai Mountains with the Afanasyevo culture, which is genetically indistinguishable from Yamnaya from a human perspective? Again, we did not have horse bones that passed screening from Afanasyevo context. So we don't know if horses spread with Yamnaya from the Altai to southeastern Europe. What the real basis is that when steppe genes spread over the Carpathians into what is today Poland and Germany in the corded ware culture, the corded ware culture did not take Yamnaya horses with it. So steppe ancestry, human ancestry, went over the Carpathians and was 70% of the ancestry of corded ware people, or maybe 80%. But they did not bring steppe horses with them. They adopted local North European horses. That's a really interesting result, but it applies to the forested environments of Northern Europe. And last year, there was a publication that we were part of because we contributed samples to on the domestication of the dog last fall, last October, and in Science. And it's indicated there that also corded ware people brought, I think, one steppe dog that was found in corded ware context, but most of the rest of the dogs, all the rest of the dogs, were local North European dogs. So they did the same thing with dogs that they did with horses. They may have brought one or two with them initially, but then they just dropped those and adopted dogs of breeds that were already there in the Neolithic, and they adopted horses of genetic ancestors that were already there in Northern Europe. So that's the limitation on the horses in Yamnaya expansion. Now, later when Dom II was developed after Yamnaya in 2200 BC, those horses spread everywhere, including in Northern Europe, and totally replaced the horses that had been there before in the context of the spread of chariot warfare.
You.
That does it.
Yeah.
So we are almost at the end. I just want to share my screen really quickly. And I need to see. Because Ernestine has worked very, very hard with one of our librarians, Zoe Borowski, on creating a virtual timeline for Marija Gimbutas. And you can visit this. The link will be put in the chat for you to see. But you can walk through this virtual exhibit, which has information about her youth, her early years, her movements through Europe, where she studied, where she taught, a little bit about her family, her first publications, and then her movements in later life, including her dissertation It has information on how she then arrived in the United States, where she worked, what she did there. And there's a lot of detail in all of these slides that I now quickly show you, including explanations of the Kurgan Hypothesis by Ernestine Elster, including lectures and thoughts that people have about her work and about her contribution. More detail about the excavations that she did. So it's really worthwhile to explore all these interactive slides that you can find online in the digital library. And I really want to give a shout out to both Ernestine Elster and Zoe Borowski to put this together. This is at least 6 months of work put together for you to enjoy and learn more. So it's a wonderful resource that is available to all of you. And I want to end with one question. And I'll start with Ernestine, and then I'll go to Jim, and then to David and Dory. Has she been vindicated?
Oh yeah, I think so. I think the very idea that everybody is now using the Kurgan hypothesis, I think she did well.
Jim?
Basically, the genetic evidence has, to a large extent, put really serious wheels on all of our arguments for most of the peoples of Europe. It has not completely resolved the Indo-European homeland problem, because the genetic character that we're chasing is a combination of what is known as Eastern hunter-gatherer gene from the steppe, but also a foreign genetic component, a Caucasian hunter-gatherer gene from a broad area from the Caucasus south to the Zagros Mountains or Eastern Iran. And that has opened up a door for all types of different types of solutions that people probably never imagined before, where part of the Indo-European world or Indo-Hittite world separates south of the Caucasus, and then the rest goes to the north, and how much goes to the north and things like that. So the idea of migration has certainly been vindicated. And I think a lot of the evidence for movements in Europe and possibly also to the east, yes, but we've been dealing this problem, for 200 years, and we ain't done yet.
All right.
No. Dory.
Well, I want to introduce sort of a slightly new thing, which is what we found when we were excavating Krasnosamorskoye in Russia several years ago, which was the evidence of a dog sacrifice. And
wolves.
And wolves, dogs and wolves in a settlement site. And there are Indo-European myths about the young men being young adolescent men, mm-hmm. Having these ceremonies where they get, what's the word?
Initiated
into adulthood, in which they have to kill a dog.
And then they become dogs or wolves.
And then they become dogs and wolves, and then their job is to go out to fishing off and go find their treasures or their whatever it is, their role in life. But it's, they go and they attack other villages, and they take the women from those villages and they bring them back. That's a big part of what they're supposed to do as young men.
In the myths.
In the Indo-European myths. Yeah. So this is something that young men are supposed to do.
And we found evidence of this in Krasnoselmarskoye, dated about 1800 BC. We found a site where probably the boys were initiated, where they consumed dogs and wolves, and by consuming the flesh became dogs and wolves themselves before going off to raid others. And this is something that's widely documented in Indo-European mythology. So one of Marija's goals was to combine the study of archaeology with the study of comparative mythology. And it's something we haven't talked about yet, and that's why we're throwing it in here at the end. It's something that both of us very much want to continue to do. We think that comparative mythology combined with linguistics, archaeology, and genetics is a whole new way of looking at the past from a multi-sided point of view. And we actually dug this site that the best explanation for it is that it was a place where this mythologically documented initiation ceremony took place, and we've got archaeological evidence for it. So that's an aspect of Marija that I hope will be picked up on by archaeologists who are reluctant to use comparative mythology in combination with archaeological evidence. But
well, there is more and more an interest in listening to indigenous voices, and mythology can be considered an indigenous voice. So I think it may well be something that will be picked up. I also want to say that if Marija would be here, she would give you 2 big kisses on each cheek to hear what you had to say. I want to thank our presenters, especially Ernestine, for all the work you've done for the timeline in preparation of this panel. Jim, for all your memories and this excellent explanation of the Kurgan theory. I think you've introduced a lot of people to this whole complicated complex of theory and finds. And David, Dory, thank you for sharing your field work, the experiments that you've done, the thoughts you've shared with us. And audience members, thank you for joining us. It was a delight to have you, and you'll definitely hear more of this going forward. Thank you all very much.